What if I told you that within 50 years of Columbus's arrival, an entire civilization would be virtually erased from existence? What if the stories you learned in school barely scratched the surface of one of history's most devastating cultural collisions? And what if the real story reveals not just conquest, but a complex web of disease, exploitation, resistance, and survival that changed the course of human history forever? Welcome back to Calm History, where we explore the stories that textbooks often gloss over, told in a way that helps you unwind while learning something fascinating. Before we begin tonight's journey, I'm curious, where are you checking in from tonight? What time is it where you are? Whether you're settling in for the evening or finding a moment of peace in your day, you're exactly where you need to be. If you truly enjoy these boring history stories that help you relax and learn, please consider giving this video a like and subscribing to our channel. Your support means everything to our growing community. And speaking of community, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. What historical topic would you like us to explore next? Or simply check in and let us know how you're doing. Each comment reminds me that you're an important part of this journey we're taking together through history's forgotten corners. For the optimal experience tonight, you might want to turn down the lights, maybe put on a fan for some gentle background noise, and get comfortable. We're about to embark on a 4-part exploration that will take us from the Caribbean islands of 1493 to the vast landscapes of North America, uncovering the real story of what happened after that fateful October day in 1492. Our first stop takes us to the island of Hispaniola, where you're about to discover why you wouldn't have lasted a day as a Taíno person in the year 1493, just 1 year after Columbus's first voyage. Picture yourself waking up in your bahau, a circular thatched house that has sheltered your family for generations. The year is 1493, and you are Taíno, one of perhaps 3 million indigenous people living across the Caribbean islands. Your world is about to change in ways that no prophecy, no dream, no ancestor's warning could have prepared you for. You stretch in your hammock, a Taíno invention that the Europeans will soon adopt and spread across the globe. The familiar sounds of your village greet you, children playing beatty, your sacred ball game, the gentle splash of someone diving for conch shells in the crystal clear waters, the rhythmic pounding of cassava being prepared for your daily bread. These sounds have marked the beginning of countless days for countless generations. Today, they mark the end of a world. Your day begins as it always has, with the cultivation of your conoco, your family's garden plot. You tend to cassava, sweet potatoes, corn, beans, and cotton, crops that require intimate knowledge passed down through generations. You know exactly when the rains will come, which soil will yield the best harvest, how to read the subtle signs in the wind and the behavior of birds. This knowledge has sustained your people for over 1,000 years on these islands. It will not save you from what's coming. As a Taíno, you live in a sophisticated society that Europeans will consistently underestimate and misrepresent. Your islands are home to complex chiefdoms, led by caciques, chiefs who govern through consensus and spiritual authority rather than force. You have developed sustainable agricultural techniques that support large populations without depleting the land. Your artisans create intricate ceremonial objects, elaborate stone collars, and beautiful pottery that reflects a rich spiritual life centered around semis, the spirits that inhabit all things. But you don't yet know that Spanish colonists are already planning their return in greater numbers. You don't know that Columbus, who your people initially welcomed with curiosity and generosity, has returned to Spain with exaggerated reports of gold and claims of docile natives ready for conversion and exploitation. You don't know that Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand have already begun organizing a much larger expedition, not of exploration, but of colonization. The morning of your last normal day passes peacefully. You might spend time weaving cotton into cloth, your skilled hands working with fibers that will soon clothe Spanish colonists. You might join a fishing expedition, your knowledge of currents and fish behavior guiding nets that will soon feed Spanish settlers. You might participate in an arraido, the ceremonial song and dance that preserves your history, tells the stories of your ancestors, and connects you to the spiritual world. These performances will soon be banned as pagan rituals. As the sun reaches its peak, you share a meal with your extended family. Cassava bread, fresh fish, tropical fruits that grow abundantly on your island, perhaps some hutia, a small mammal that your hunters caught in the forest. The food is fresh, the portions generous, the conversation filled with the daily concerns of a thriving community. Someone mentions strange dreams, others speak of unusual bird behavior, but mostly the talk centers around normal things. The harvest, upcoming ceremonies, family news, the trivial concerns of people who believe their world is permanent. You don't know that European diseases are already spreading through the Caribbean, moving faster than the Spanish themselves. Smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza, diseases for which your population has no immunity, are beginning their devastating work. Unlike the Europeans, who have lived alongside these diseases for millennia and developed some resistance, your people have been isolated from these pathogens. Your immune systems, perfectly adapted to your environment, are defenseless against these invisible invaders. The first symptoms might seem like nothing more than a fever, a cough, fatigue after a long day's work. But within days, sometimes hours, the sickness spreads through entire families, entire villages. Bodies that were strong enough to swim great distances, to carry heavy loads, to work from sunrise to sunset, suddenly become weak and fevered. Traditional healers, the Bohiques who have successfully treated every illness known to your people, find their remedies powerless against these new diseases. You watch as your children, the future of your lineage, sicken and die. Your elders, the repositories of wisdom, stories, and cultural knowledge, are among the first to succumb. In some villages, the death rate reaches 90%. Families that have lived on the same land for centuries are wiped out in a matter of weeks. The social structure that has governed your people for generations begins to collapse, as there simply aren't enough healthy adults left to maintain it. But disease is only the beginning of your ordeal. As Spanish settlers arrive in greater numbers, they implement a system called encomienda, which grants Spanish colonists the right to extract tribute and labor from indigenous communities. In theory, this system is supposed to be reciprocal, with Spanish encomenderos providing protection and religious instruction in exchange for labor. In practice, it becomes a form of slavery that works indigenous people to death. You'll find yourself forced to work in Spanish mines, searching for gold that exists in much smaller quantities than Columbus promised his investors. The work is backbreaking, dangerous, and completely foreign to your traditional way of life. You're accustomed to sustainable agriculture, to fishing, to crafts that connect you to your spiritual beliefs and community life. Now you spend 12 to 16 hours a day in dark, narrow mine shafts, your hands bleeding from handling rough tools, your lungs filling with dust, your back bent in positions that cause constant pain. The Spanish impose quotas that are impossible to meet. Every 3 months, every Tanoa dole must provide a specific amount of gold dust. Those who fail are punished with beatings, mutilation, or death. The pressure to meet these quotas forces you to abandon your traditional agricultural cycles, which leads to food shortages that compound the disaster already unfolding from disease and overwork. Your traditional diet, rich in fish, cassava, fruits, and vegetables, is replaced by whatever scraps the Spanish provide. Often this consists of barely edible corn mush or spoiled meat. Malnutrition weakens your body's ability to fight off disease and makes the physical demands of forced labor even more devastating. Children who should be learning the songs, stories, and skills of their ancestors instead become weak and sickly, many dying before they reach adulthood. The Spanish also systematically destroy your religious and cultural practices. Your semis, the sacred objects that connect you to the spiritual world, are destroyed as idolatrous. Your ritos are banned, cutting you off from the songs and dances that preserve your history and cultural identity. Your rehiks are forbidden from practicing traditional medicine and are often killed as witches or devil worshippers. Perhaps most tragically, your language begins to disappear. As communities are broken up and people are forced into Spanish settlements, children grow up speaking Spanish rather than Taíno. The subtle nuances of your language, the words that describe your relationship to the land, to the spirits, to each other, begin to fade. Each lost word represents not just communication, but an entire way of understanding and relating to the world. Resistance exists, but it is met with an overwhelming force. Some Taíno communities retreat to the mountains, trying to maintain their traditional way of life away from Spanish settlements. Others resist more directly, attacking Spanish installations or refusing to work. The Spanish response is swift and brutal. Entire villages suspected of harboring resistors are burned. Leaders are publicly executed in ways designed to terrorize other communities into submission. The psychological toll of this destruction cannot be underestimated. You are witnessing the end of everything your ancestors built, everything that gave your life meaning and structure. The landscapes that were once filled with the sounds of your language, your music, your daily activities, become quiet. The sacred sites where your people conducted ceremonies for centuries are either destroyed or appropriated for Spanish use. By 1508, just 16 years after Columbus's first voyage, the Taíno population of Hispaniola has dropped from an estimated 400,000 to perhaps 60,000. By 1548, fewer than Wubai Taíno people remain on the entire island. This represents one of the most complete demographic collapses in recorded human history, a catastrophe that unfolds not over centuries, but over decades. Your daily reality as a Taíno person in 1493 would have been one of constant fear, back-breaking labor, inadequate food, the loss of family members to disease and violence, and the systematic destruction of everything that once made life meaningful. You would wake each day not knowing if you would survive until evening, not knowing if your children would live to see another sunrise, not knowing if any trace of your people's 1,000-year history would survive the decade. The tragedy of the Taíno experience is not just one of numbers, though those numbers are staggering. It is the loss of entire ways of being human, entire systems of knowledge, entire languages and cultures that had evolved over centuries to create sustainable, meaningful lives in harmony with the Caribbean environment. When the last Taíno speaker died, when the last person who remembered the old songs passed away, when the final artisan who knew how to create traditional ceremonial objects succumbed to disease or violence, humanity lost irreplaceable treasures. This is why you wouldn't have lasted a day as a Taíno in 1493. Not because you weren't strong enough, not because your ancestors weren't wise enough, but because you would have been facing forces so overwhelming, so unprecedented, that no amount of individual courage or cultural wisdom could have protected you. You would have been caught in the collision between two worlds, one of which was destined to destroy the other, not through any inherent superiority, but through the accident of immunity to diseases and access to technologies that gave one side an insurmountable advantage. Yet even in the face of this overwhelming catastrophe, the Taíno people found ways to resist and adapt that revealed the remarkable resilience of human spirit. Some communities developed elaborate networks of hidden caves and mountain settlements where they attempted to preserve their traditional ways of life. In these refuges, scattered families continued to speak their ancestral language, practiced their ceremonies in secret, and maintained the agricultural knowledge that had sustained them for generations. Archaeological evidence reveals that some Taino communities survived longer than Spanish records suggest, adapting their cultural practices to avoid detection while maintaining their essential identity. They developed new forms of pottery that appeared Spanish on the surface, but incorporated traditional Taino symbols and meanings that could be read by those who knew the old ways. They taught their children European skills that would help them survive, while secretly passing down indigenous knowledge through stories, songs, and practices disguised as games or innocent customs. Women played a particularly crucial role in this cultural preservation. Taino women often became the primary carriers of indigenous knowledge, teaching their children in Spanish households how to identify traditional medicinal plants, how to read weather patterns according to ancient wisdom, and how to maintain spiritual connections to the land and ancestors even within the constraints of colonial society. These acts of cultural resistance required extraordinary courage, as discovery could mean death, not just for themselves, but for their entire families. The intermarriage between Spanish colonists and surviving Taino women, while often forced and exploitative, also created unexpected opportunities for cultural continuity. Children of these unions sometimes learned both Spanish colonial culture and fragments of Taino knowledge, becoming bridges between worlds that official colonial policy sought to keep completely separate. Through these complex family relationships, elements of Taino, language, cuisine, agricultural techniques, and spiritual practices survived in forms that Spanish authorities didn't recognize as indigenous resistance. Even the landscape itself became a form of resistance and memory. Taino agriculturau techniques, particularly their sophisticated understanding of tropical farming, proved so superior to European methods that Spanish colonists were forced to adopt them. The Three Sisters method of planting corn, beans, and squash together. The use of raised fields called conocos to prevent erosion, and the selection and cultivation of cassava varieties that could thrive in Caribbean conditions, all became essential elements of colonial survival, ensuring that Taino agricultural wisdom outlived the political structures that had originally developed it. The Spanish found themselves increasingly dependent on the very knowledge systems they were systematically trying to destroy. Taino expertise in navigation, fishing, hurricane prediction, and tropical medicine became indispensable to colonial success. Surviving Taino individuals who possessed this knowledge found themselves in the paradoxical position of being both essential to and targeted by the colonial system, walking a careful line between usefulness and invisibility that required constant vigilance and adaptation. As we move forward in our exploration tonight, remember that this story of the Taino experience represents just the opening chapter of a much larger and more complex narrative. The patterns of exploitation, resistance, and adaptation that we see playing out in the Caribbean islands between 1493 and 1550 would be repeated, modified and intensified as European colonization spread to the mainland. But each indigenous community that encountered this expansion brought their own sophisticated societies, their own forms of resistance, and their own strategies for survival and adaptation. Your experience as a Taino person in this catastrophic period would have also involved witnessing the complete breakdown of the economic systems that had sustained your people for generations. The traditional trade networks that connected different Caribbean islands, allowing for the exchange of goods, knowledge, and cultural practices, began to collapse as communities were decimated by disease and forced labor. The canoes that once carried trade goods between islands now carried refugees, fleeing Spanish violence, or desperate families searching for relatives who had been taken to work in distant mines. The spiritual dimension of this catastrophe cannot be overstated. Your worldview as a Taíno person was built around the understanding that humans, nature, and spirits existed in careful balance, maintained through ceremonies, offerings, and respectful treatment of the natural world. But as your people died in unprecedented numbers, as your sacred sites were desecrated, as your ceremonies were banned and your spiritual leaders were killed or silenced, this entire cosmological framework began to crumble. You would have struggled to understand why the semis, the spirits that had protected your ancestors for generations, seemed powerless against these new threats. Your Bahigs, the spiritual leaders who could communicate with the spirit world and heal the sick, found their traditional remedies ineffective against European diseases. This spiritual crisis was perhaps as devastating as the physical destruction, as it undermined the very foundations of meaning and purpose that had organized Taíno life for centuries. The Spanish also brought new animals that transformed the Caribbean landscape in ways that further disrupted traditional Taíno life. Pigs, cattle, and horses introduced by colonists damaged the carefully managed agricultural plots that Taíno communities had developed. These animals trampled crops, consumed food stores, and competed with native species for resources. Wild pigs became particularly destructive, rooting through gardens and consuming cassava plants that represented months of careful cultivation. The environmental knowledge that you possessed as a Taíno person, knowledge about which plants were edible or medicinal, which areas were best for farming or fishing, how to predict weather patterns and seasonal changes, became increasingly irrelevant in a landscape transformed by European agricultural practices and introduced species. The intimate relationship between your people and the land, developed over more than 1,000 years of careful observation and adaptation, was severed within a single generation. Family structures that had provided stability and identity for countless generations began to collapse under the pressure of death, displacement, and forced labor. Extended families that had lived together in the same Ohio for generations were torn apart as individuals were assigned to different Spanish encomenderos. Children grew up without grandparents to teach them traditional stories and skills. Young people reached adulthood without the ceremonies and initiation rites that had marked these transitions for their ancestors. The loss of elders was particularly devastating to Taíno society. In cultures that transmitted knowledge orally rather than through writing, elders served as living libraries of information about history, customs, agricultural techniques, medicinal plants, and spiritual practices. When disease killed the elderly at disproportionate rates, as it often did, entire bodies of knowledge disappeared in a matter of weeks. Skills that had taken decades to master, stories that preserved important cultural lessons, songs that connected people to their ancestors, all vanished with each elder who died without the opportunity to pass on their knowledge. The psychological trauma of watching your entire world collapse would have been compounded by the brutal violence that accompanied Spanish colonization. Public executions designed to terrorize indigenous populations into submission, the casual brutality of overseers in the mines and fields, the sexual violence that Spanish colonists routinely inflicted on indigenous women, all created an atmosphere of constant fear and helplessness that made resistance seem futile and survival itself uncertain. Some Taíno people, facing this overwhelming catastrophe, chose to resist through the ultimate act of defiance, refusing to bring children into a world of slavery and suffering. Historical accounts mention indigenous women who used traditional plant knowledge to induce abortions rather than give birth to children who would be enslaved by the Spanish. Other families chose collective suicide, entire communities drinking poison or drowning themselves rather than continuing to live under Spanish domination. These acts of desperate resistance revealed the psychological dimensions of conquest that numbers alone cannot capture. The decision to end one's own life, or to prevent future generations from being born into slavery, represents a level of despair and hopelessness that challenges our ability to fully comprehend the indigenous experience of early colonization. These were not passive victims accepting their fate, but people making active choices about how to respond to impossible circumstances. Yet even in these darkest moments, some Taíno individuals found ways to assert agency and maintain dignity. Those who managed to escape to the mountains created maroon communities that preserved fragments of traditional life while adapting to new circumstances. These communities developed sophisticated systems for avoiding Spanish detection, using their intimate knowledge of the landscape to create settlements in locations that were defensible and sustainable, but difficult for Spanish forces to locate. The material culture that you would have used in daily life as a Taíno person also underwent rapid transformation during this period. Traditional pottery, tools, and textiles began to incorporate European materials and techniques out of necessity. Iron tools obtained through trade or salvage were incorporated into traditional designs. European cloth was adapted to Taíno clothing styles. This material syncretism represents both cultural loss and creative adaptation, as indigenous people found ways to maintain their identity while accommodating the new resources and constraints of the colonial world. The few Taíno individuals who learned Spanish and could serve as interpreters or intermediaries found themselves in complex and often dangerous positions. They could potentially use their position to help their communities, providing information about Spanish intentions or negotiating better treatment, but they were also viewed with suspicion by both Spanish colonists, who saw them as potentially disloyal, and by their own people, who might view them as collaborators. These individuals navigated impossible ethical dilemmas, trying to survive and perhaps help their communities in a situation where every choice carried potentially fatal consequences. The documentation of this catastrophe by Spanish observers reveals the moral blindness that often accompanied colonization. While some Spanish priests and officials expressed concern about the treatment of indigenous peoples, these concerns were usually focused on the souls of the colonists rather than the suffering of indigenous people. The debate over whether indigenous people had souls and deserved humane treatment reveals the dehumanization that made such systematic exploitation possible. As your world as a Taíno person collapsed around you in those final decades of the 15th and early 16th centuries, you would have experienced not just physical suffering, but the existential horror of watching an entire civilization disappear. The places where your ancestors were buried, the trees they had planted, the paths they had walked, all remained, but the people who gave these places meaning were gone. The language that had described your relationship to the land and to each other fell silent. The songs that had celebrated births, mourned deaths, and marked the turning of seasons were no longer sung. This is the reality of what it meant to be Taíno in the years following Columbus's arrival. It is a story not just of demographic collapse, but of cultural genocide, of the systematic destruction of an entire way of being human that had evolved over centuries to create meaningful, sustainable lives in the Caribbean environment. When we speak of the impact of Columbus on the Americas, we must understand it not as an abstract historical process, but as the lived experience of millions of individuals who watched their world end and struggled to find meaning, dignity, and survival in the ruins. The story of what happened to Native Americans after Columbus begins here, with this almost complete destruction of the Caribbean's indigenous peoples, but it continues with tales of survival, adaptation, and resistance that challenge every simple narrative about conquest and colonization. The patterns established in the Caribbean, the systems of exploitation, the attitudes toward indigenous peoples, the economic motives that drove colonization would soon spread to the mainland, where they would encounter indigenous societies even more complex and numerous than those of the Caribbean islands. The life and resistance of Tecumseh, a Shawnee leader's fight for indigenous unity. As we transition into our second segment, we shift our focus from the Caribbean islands to the vast forests and rivers of the Ohio Valley, where 3 centuries after Columbus first set foot in the Americas, indigenous peoples were still fighting to preserve their way of life. Here, in the heart of what would become the American Midwest, we encounter one of the most remarkable figures in Native American history, a Shawnee war chief whose vision of indigenous unity would challenge the entire foundation of American westward expansion. In the year 1768, in a Shawnee village along the Scioto River in what is now Ohio, a child was born who would grow to become perhaps the greatest indigenous leader of his generation. His name was Tecumseh, meaning shooting star or blazing comet, a name that would prove prophetic for a man whose brief but brilliant career would streak across the political landscape of early America, leaving a trail of inspiration, fear, and ultimately, tragedy. Tecumseh's birth coincided with one of the most turbulent periods in Native American history. The French and Indian War had recently ended, fundamentally altering the balance of power in North America. The British had defeated the French, but rather than bringing peace, this victory had unleashed a flood of American colonists eager to claim lands west of the Appalachian Mountains. For the Shawnee and other indigenous peoples of the Ohio Valley, this represented an existential threat unlike anything they had previously faced. The Shawnee were a semi-nomadic people who had migrated throughout the Ohio Valley and beyond for generations, following seasonal patterns of hunting, fishing, and agriculture that kept them in harmony with the natural cycles of the land. They were skilled warriors, diplomatic negotiators, and deeply spiritual people who saw themselves as the guardians of their ancestral territories. But by the time of Tecumseh's birth, they found themselves caught between expanding American settlements and their own traditions of independence and mobility. Tecumseh's childhood was marked by constant warfare and displacement. When he was just 6 years old, his father, Puckeshinwau, a respected Shawnee war chief, was killed fighting against Virginia militiamen at the Battle of Point Pleasant. This loss would shape Tecumseh's entire worldview, instilling in him both a deep hatred of American encroachment and an understanding that traditional tribal responses to this threat were proving inadequate. Growing up without a father in a society under constant pressure, Tecumseh learned early that survival required both physical courage and political sophistication. He trained as a warrior under the guidance of his older brother Chizoko, learning not just the skills of combat, but the deeper principles of Shawnee warfare, which emphasized swift strikes, strategic retreats, and the preservation of fighting forces rather than glorious but costly battles. But Tecumseh was more than just a warrior. From his youth, he displayed an unusual gift for oratory, an ability to speak with such passion and eloquence that he could move listeners to tears, to rage, or to action. In Shawnee society, the ability to speak well was considered one of the highest virtues, and Tecumseh's reputation as an orator began to spread throughout the Ohio Valley while he was still a young man. As Tecumseh matured, he began to develop ideas that would set him apart from other indigenous leaders of his time. While many tribal chiefs focused on protecting their own people through negotiation, accommodation, or isolated resistance, Tecumseh began to envision something far more ambitious and revolutionary. He imagined a grand confederation of all indigenous peoples, from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, united in common cause against American expansion. This vision was born from Tecumseh's observation that individual tribes, no matter how brave or skilled in warfare, could not indefinitely resist the seemingly endless stream of American settlers. The Americans had overwhelming advantages in population, technology, and resources. But if all indigenous peoples could unite, if they could coordinate their resistance and present a unified front, then perhaps they could halt American expansion and preserve their ancestral lands. The development of this vision was aided by Tecumseh's younger brother, Lalawetheka, who experienced a profound spiritual awakening in 1805 and became known as Tenskwatawa, the open door, or more commonly, the prophet. Tenskwatawa preached a return to traditional indigenous ways, the rejection of European goods and customs, and the spiritual unity of all indigenous peoples. Where Tecumseh provided the political and military leadership for indigenous resistance, Tenskwatawa provided the spiritual and cultural foundation. Together, the brothers established a new settlement called Prophetstown at the confluence of the Wabash and Tippecanoe rivers in what is now Indiana. This community became a gathering place for indigenous peoples from dozens of different tribes, all drawn by the message of unity and resistance that Tecumseh and the prophet preached. Here, Shawnee warriors trained alongside Creek fighters, Potawatomi hunters, shared camps with Cherokee diplomats, and dozens of distinct indigenous cultures began to forge a common identity based on their shared opposition to American expansion. Tecumseh spent the years between 1808 and 1811 traveling constantly, visiting indigenous communities throughout the eastern half of North America, from the Great Lakes to the Gulf Coast. His message was consistent wherever he went. Individual tribal resistance was doomed to failure, but united indigenous resistance could succeed. He spoke to Creek councils in Alabama, Seminole gatherings in Florida, Cherokee assemblies in Tennessee, and Iroquois confederations in New York. His oratory during these visits became legendary. Witnesses, both indigenous and white, described Tecumseh as possessing an almost hypnotic ability to move his audiences. He spoke without notes, often for hours at a time, painting vivid pictures of what life had been like before European contact, describing the ongoing losses that indigenous peoples were suffering, and outlining his vision of what could be achieved through unity. One of his most famous speeches, delivered to a gathering of Creek leaders in Alabama in 1811, captures both his rhetorical power and his strategic thinking. He spoke of the white settlers as a plague that would consume everything in its path unless it was stopped. The white race is a wicked race. Since the days when the white race first came in contact with the red men, there has been a continual series of aggressions. The hunting grounds are fast disappearing, and they are driving the red men farther and farther to the west. Such has been the fate of the Shawnee, and surely will be the fate of all tribes if the power of the whites is not forever crushed. But Tecumseh was not simply preaching hatred or revenge. His vision included a sophisticated understanding of how an indigenous confederation could function politically and militarily. He proposed that all land sales to the United States should cease immediately, that no individual tribe should have the authority to cede territory that belonged to all indigenous peoples collectively, and that any future negotiations with the American government should be conducted by the Confederation as a whole, rather than by individual tribes. This political vision was revolutionary not just in its scope, but in its challenge to traditional indigenous political structures. Most tribes operated as independent entities, making decisions through their own councils and chiefs. Tecumseh was proposing a level of political integration that would require individual tribes to surrender some of their autonomy for the greater good of indigenous resistance. The urgency of Tecumseh's mission increased dramatically as American pressure on indigenous lands intensified during the early 1800s. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803 had given the United States vast new territories to the west. But this seemed only to increase rather than decrease pressure on indigenous lands in the Ohio Valley and southeast. American settlers wanted the rich agricultural lands of Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, and they were increasingly impatient with any indigenous presence that might interfere with their expansion. William Henry Harrison, the territorial governor of Indiana, became Tecumseh's primary antagonist during this period. Harrison was a skilled politician and military officer who understood the threat that Tecumseh's confederation represented to American expansion. He worked systematically to undermine indigenous unity, negotiating separate treaties with individual tribes, bribing cooperative chiefs, and using both diplomatic pressure and military threats to prevent tribes from joining Tecumseh's movement. The conflict between Tecumseh and Harrison came to a head in September 1811, when Harrison led an army of about 1,000 men toward Prophetstown. Tecumseh was away at the time, traveling among the southern tribes to build support for his confederation. In his absence, his brother Tenskwatawa made the fateful decision to attack Harrison's force at the Battle of Tippecanoe. The battle was a tactical disaster for the indigenous confederation. Tenskwatawa had promised his warriors that his spiritual power would protect them from American bullets. But when the fighting began, indigenous warriors died just as easily as they always had. The defeat shattered belief in the prophet's spiritual authority and gave Harrison a military victory that he would later use to win the American presidency. When Tecumseh returned to find Prophetstown burned and his brother's credibility destroyed, he faced the greatest crisis of his career. Years of careful diplomatic work building the Confederation had been undone in a single disastrous battle. Many tribes that had been moving toward alliance with Tecumseh began to reconsider their positions, and American confidence in their ability to defeat indigenous resistance reached new heights. But rather than abandoning his vision, Tecumseh chose to double down on his strategy of indigenous unity. When the War of 1812 broke out between the United States and Britain, he saw an opportunity to align his confederation with the British, who promised to establish an independent indigenous state in the Ohio Valley if they won the war. Tecumseh's alliance with the British was pragmatic rather than ideological. He had no particular love for the British Empire, but he recognized that Britain was the only power capable of providing the military support that his confederation needed to defeat the United States. Working with British General Isaac Brock, Tecumseh helped plan and execute a series of remarkable military victories in the early stages of the war. The capture of Detroit in August 1812 represented the high point of Tecumseh's military career. Through a combination of indigenous stealth tactics and conventional European military strategy, Tecumseh and Brock managed to force the surrender of a much larger American army without a major battle. For a brief moment, it seemed as though Tecumseh's vision of an independent indigenous confederation might actually be achievable. But the death of General Brock at the Battle of Queenston Heights in October 1812 deprived Tecumseh of his most important ally and marked the beginning of the end for indigenous hopes in the War of 1812. Brock's replacement, Colonel Henry Proctor, was far less competent and far less committed to indigenous interests. As American forces regrouped and launched new offensives, the British began to retreat, often without consulting their indigenous allies. The final phase of Tecumseh's life was marked by increasing desperation and isolation. As British forces retreated deeper into Canada, Tecumseh found himself fighting not just to achieve his vision of indigenous unity, but simply to prevent the complete destruction of his confederation. His warriors were exhausted, his supplies were running low, and his British allies seemed increasingly unreliable. On October 5, 1813, at the Battle of the Thames in southern Ontario, Tecumseh made his final stand. Facing an American army led by William Henry Harrison, the same man who had destroyed Prophetstown 2 years earlier. Tecumseh and his remaining warriors fought with the desperate courage of men who knew they were fighting for the survival of their people and their way of life. Tecumseh was killed in the battle, shot down while leading a charge against American lines. With his death, the dream of a unified indigenous confederation died as well. Without his leadership, the alliance fractured. Individual tribes made separate peace with the United States, and the pattern of piecemeal resistance and gradual dispossession that Tecumseh had tried to break resumed. The tragedy of Tecumseh's story lies not in his failure, but in how close he came to success. His vision of indigenous unity was both strategically sound and morally compelling. Had he been able to unite all of the indigenous peoples of eastern North America? Had the War of 1812 gone differently? Had any of a dozen variables shifted in his favor, the entire history of American expansion might have unfolded differently. Instead, Tecumseh's death marked the end of effective indigenous resistance east of the Mississippi River. Within a generation, most of the tribes that had considered joining his confederation would be forcibly removed to lands west of the Mississippi. Their traditional territories opened to white settlement, their cultures suppressed or destroyed. The personal qualities that made Tecumseh such an effective leader extended beyond his military prowess and oratorical gifts. Contemporary accounts from both indigenous people and white observers consistently describe him as a man of exceptional integrity and moral character. Unlike many leaders of his time, both indigenous and European, Tecumseh refused to torture prisoners, prohibited the killing of non-combatants, and maintained strict ethical standards even in the midst of brutal warfare. This ethical stance was not simply personal preference, but reflected Tecumseh's broader vision of how indigenous resistance should be conducted. He understood that the moral authority of indigenous peoples in their conflict with American expansion depended on maintaining the high ground, on demonstrating that indigenous societies were civilized, honorable, and deserving of respect and fair treatment. When his warriors violated his prohibitions against atrocities, he disciplined them publicly, understanding that such actions undermined the political cause he was trying to advance. Tecumseh's relationships with individual Americans reveal the complexity of his worldview. Despite his implacable opposition to American territorial expansion, he developed genuine friendships with certain American officers and frontiersmen who treated him with respect. These relationships were not contradictory to his resistance, but reflected his understanding that the conflict between indigenous peoples and American settlers was fundamentally political and territorial rather than racial or personal. The diplomatic challenges that Tecumseh faced in building his confederation were immense and often underestimated by later historians. Indigenous peoples of the eastern woodlands spoke dozens of different languages, practiced different customs, and had centuries of history that included both alliances and conflicts with each other. Convincing Creek warriors to ally with Shawnee fighters, or persuading Cherokee leaders to join forces with their traditional Iroquois rivals, required overcoming deep-seated suspicions and historical grievances. Tecumseh's approach to these diplomatic challenges demonstrated remarkable cultural sensitivity and political acumen. He learned enough of various indigenous languages to communicate directly with different groups, rather than relying entirely on interpreters whose translations might miss crucial nuances. He studied the specific histories and concerns of each tribe he visited, tailoring his message to address their particular circumstances while maintaining the core vision of indigenous unity. The religious dimension of Tecumseh's movement, primarily articulated by his brother the Prophet, addressed a spiritual crisis that was afflicting indigenous communities throughout the eastern woodlands. As American settlement expanded and traditional ways of life became increasingly difficult to maintain, many indigenous people struggled with alcoholism, social breakdown, and a sense of cultural despair. The prophet's message of spiritual renewal and return to traditional values offered hope and purpose to communities that felt they were losing their identity. The spiritual teachings that Tenskwatawa preached were not simply conservative calls to return to an idealized past, but represented a creative synthesis of traditional, indigenous spirituality with new ideas developed in response to the crisis of colonization. The prophet's vision, quests, and revelations addressed the specific challenges that indigenous peoples faced in the early 19th century, providing spiritual explanations for their suffering while offering practical guidance for cultural survival and resistance. However, the religious aspect of Tecumseh's movement also created tensions that ultimately weakened the Confederation. The prophet's claims of supernatural power and divine guidance attracted many followers, but also created expectations that could not be fulfilled. When his promises of spiritual protection proved ineffective at the Battle of Tippecanoe, the resulting disillusionment damaged not just his own credibility, but the broader political movement that Tecumseh had been building. The economic foundations of indigenous resistance were another crucial element of Tecumseh's strategy that often goes unexamined. Indigenous communities needed resources to sustain their resistance: weapons, ammunition, food supplies, and trade goods that could be used to maintain alliances and support warriors and their families. Tecumseh worked to develop economic relationships that could provide these resources while maintaining indigenous independence from both American and British control. The fur trade remained crucial to indigenous economies during this period, but it also created dependencies that complicated resistance efforts. Indigenous hunters needed European-manufactured goods, particularly guns, ammunition, and metal tools, which could only be obtained through trade with either British or American merchants. Tecumseh tried to balance these economic necessities with political independence, seeking to maintain trade relationships while avoiding the kinds of debts and dependencies that had been used to manipulate indigenous leaders. The role of indigenous women in Tecumseh's movement deserves particular attention, as they are often invisible in traditional historical accounts that focus on male warriors and leaders. Women in Shawnee and other indigenous societies played crucial roles in agricultural production, controlled significant economic resources, and often had political influence through clan structures and council participation. The decisions that indigenous communities made about whether to join Tecumseh's confederation were not made by male warriors alone, but involved entire communities, including women whose support was essential. Indigenous women also bore particular burdens during the period of Tecumseh's resistance. As warfare intensified and indigenous communities were displaced from their traditional territories, women lost access to the agricultural lands, gathering sites, and kinship networks that had sustained their economic and social roles. The breakdown of traditional gender roles and economic relationships added another dimension to the cultural crisis that Tecumseh was trying to address through political and military resistance. The intelligence networks that Tecumseh developed to coordinate his confederation represented a remarkable feat of communication and organization. In an era before telecommunications, maintaining contact between indigenous communities scattered across thousands of miles required elaborate systems of runners, intermediaries, and coded messages. Tecumseh created networks that could relay information about American military movements, coordinate diplomatic initiatives, and maintain communication between allied tribes even during active warfare. These intelligence systems also worked to counter American efforts to divide indigenous communities through misinformation and manipulation. American agents regularly attempted to spread false rumors about Tecumseh's intentions, to bribe indigenous leaders into abandoning the Confederation, and to sow distrust between different tribal groups. Tecumseh's ability to maintain communication and trust across his confederation in the face of these efforts demonstrates sophisticated understanding of both intelligence operations and political psychology. The environmental knowledge that indigenous peoples possessed gave them significant military advantages that Tecumseh exploited in his campaigns. Indigenous warriors understood the forests, rivers, and seasonal patterns of the Ohio Valley and Great Lakes region in ways that American soldiers, often recent immigrants from Europe or the eastern seaboard, could not match. Tecumseh used this knowledge to plan ambushes, select defensible positions, and move large groups of warriors quickly and secretly through terrain that American forces found nearly impassable. But this environmental knowledge was also at the heart of what indigenous peoples were fighting to preserve. The lands that Americans saw as wilderness waiting to be tamed and settled were, to indigenous peoples, familial territories filled with specific meanings, memories, and spiritual significance. Every river, hill, and forest grove had names in indigenous languages and associations with historical events, spiritual beliefs, or seasonal activities. The loss of these lands meant not just economic displacement, but the severing of connections to places that were integral to indigenous identity and culture. The military tactics that Tecumseh developed reflected both traditional indigenous warfare practices and adaptive responses to the changing nature of conflict with American forces. Indigenous warfare had traditionally emphasized quick raids, ambushes, and the preservation of warriors' lives over the European emphasis on holding ground and accepting heavy casualties in set-piece battles. Tecumseh maintained these traditional emphases while incorporating elements of European military organization that increased the effectiveness of indigenous forces in sustained campaigns. His alliance with the British during the War of 1812 required integrating indigenous warriors with British, regular army units, and Canadian militia, creating hybrid forces that combined different military traditions and tactical approaches. Tecumseh proved remarkably adept at this kind of military coordination, understanding when to use traditional indigenous tactics of stealth and mobility and when to adopt European methods of sustained siege operations or defensive warfare. The psychological warfare that both sides employed during this conflict reveals the bitter intensity of the struggle. American forces regularly burned indigenous villages, destroyed food stores, and killed non-combatants to terrorize indigenous communities into submission. Indigenous warriors responded with their own forms of psychological warfare, including raids that targeted isolated frontier settlements and created fear among American settlers. Tecumseh attempted to limit the most extreme forms of violence, but the conflict inevitably descended into a brutality that made reconciliation increasingly difficult. Yet Tecumseh's legacy extends far beyond his military and political achievements. He represented a different way of thinking about indigenous identity and resistance, one that transcended tribal boundaries and imagined a future in which indigenous peoples could preserve their sovereignty and their way of life through unity rather than accommodation. His vision of Penende's solidarity would inspire later generations of indigenous leaders, from the American Indian movement of the 1960s to contemporary efforts to build indigenous political cooperation across national boundaries. The mystery of the lost colony of Roanoke, unraveling indigenous relations and cultural exchange. As we enter our third segment, we turn our attention to one of early American history's most enduring mysteries, a puzzle that has captivated historians and archaeologists for over 4 centuries. But this isn't simply a story about vanished colonists or cryptic clues carved into trees. The mystery of Roanoke opens a window into a largely hidden world of indigenous diplomacy, cultural exchange, and survival strategies that challenges everything we think we know about early encounters between Europeans and Native Americans. In the late 16th century, nearly a century before the establishment of Jamestown or Plymouth, English attempts at colonization in North America began not with the famous settlements we remember, but with a series of experimental ventures that reveal far more complex relationships between Europeans and indigenous peoples than traditional narratives suggest. The story of Roanoke is really the story of the Croatoan people, the Sicotan Confederacy, and other Algonquian-speaking tribes of the Outer Banks, whose sophisticated diplomatic and survival strategies may have saved not just themselves, but the very English colonists who were supposedly lost to history. To understand this mystery, we must first travel back to 1584, when the English explorer Arthur Barlow led the first reconnaissance mission to what would later be called the Virginia coast. Barlow's reports back to England paint a picture of indigenous peoples that differs dramatically from the hostile savages that populate later colonial narratives. Instead, he describes sophisticated societies with complex political structures, extensive trade networks, and diplomatic protocols that seemed designed to manage relationships with foreign peoples. The indigenous peoples that Barlow encountered were not isolated tribes struggling for survival in a wilderness, but members of interconnected political confederations that controlled territory from the Chesapeake Bay to the Neuse River. The Sicotan Confederacy, led by chiefs like Wangina and later Wanjis, governed dozens of villages and controlled access to some of the richest fishing and hunting grounds on the Atlantic coast. These were peoples who had been managing complex political relationships, trade agreements, and territorial disputes for generations before any European arrived. When Sir Walter Raleigh organized the first attempt to establish a permanent English settlement in 1585, he was entering into a political landscape that was already densely populated and carefully managed. The 108 colonists who landed on Roanoke Island under the leadership of Ralph Lane were not pioneers entering an empty wilderness, but foreign diplomats entering a world of existing alliances, trade relationships, and territorial boundaries that they barely understood. The indigenous strategy for dealing with these English newcomers reveals a level of political sophistication that European accounts consistently underestimated, rather than immediately attacking or welcoming the colonists. Indigenous leaders like Wangina pursued a careful policy of controlled engagement. They provided the English with enough assistance to survive, but not enough to become truly independent. They shared some knowledge about local resources and navigation, but withheld other crucial information. They established trade relationships that benefited both sides, but maintained strict control over access to their territory and resources. This strategy reflected a deep understanding of the colonists, vulnerabilities and dependence on indigenous knowledge for survival. The English had arrived with impressive ships and weapons, but they knew almost nothing about how to obtain food, fresh water, or shelter in their new environment. They were completely dependent on indigenous peoples for basic survival, and indigenous leaders were well aware of this dependency. The archaeological record reveals that during the first Roanoke colony's brief existence, there was extensive cultural exchange between English colonists and indigenous peoples. English artifacts have been found in indigenous villages throughout the region, while indigenous pottery, tools, and food remains have been discovered in colonial sites. This suggests a level of daily interaction and cooperation that goes far beyond the simple trade relationships described in English accounts. But this cooperation existed alongside growing tensions that reflected fundamental misunderstandings about land use, political authority, and cultural practices. The English assumed that their presence gave them rights to the land and its resources, while indigenous peoples viewed the colonists as temporary guests who needed permission for any significant activities. When English demands for food and assistance increased beyond what indigenous communities considered reasonable, conflicts began to emerge. The mystery deepens when we examine what happened to Ralph Lane's colony in 1586. Official English accounts suggest that the colonists abandoned Roanoke after conflicts with indigenous peoples made their position untenable. But archaeological evidence suggests a more complex story. Rather than simply fleeing back to England, some colonists may have integrated into indigenous communities, adopting local survival strategies and cultural practices that their European contemporaries would have considered impossible or shameful. The second Roanoke colony, established in 1587 under John White's leadership, included families with women and children, suggesting a more serious attempt at permanent settlement. But it also included individuals who had learned from the first colony's experiences and were more prepared to adapt to local conditions and relationships. Eleanor Dare, John White's daughter, gave birth to Virginia Dare on Roanoke Island, making her the first English child born in North America. But Virginia Dare's fate, like that of the entire second colony, remains one of history's greatest puzzles. When John White returned to Roanoke in 1590, after being delayed in England by the Spanish Armada crisis, he found the settlement abandoned with only cryptic clues remaining. The word Croatoan carved into a fence post and crow carved into a tree have inspired centuries of speculation. But recent archaeological and anthropological research suggests these clues point toward a solution that early English investigators either couldn't imagine or refused to acknowledge. The Croatoan people, led by Chief Manteo, who had traveled to England and maintained friendly relations with the English, controlled Hatteras Island and had consistently been the most cooperative of the indigenous groups in the region. Archaeological excavations on Hatteras Island have uncovered a fascinating mixture of English and indigenous artifacts dating to the late 16th century, including English-made copper, iron tools, and pottery fragments found alongside traditional indigenous items in contexts that suggest long-term cohabitation rather than brief trading encounters. Perhaps most intriguingly, recent archaeological work has uncovered evidence of a 16th century settlement on Hatteras Island that shows clear signs of both English and indigenous construction techniques. Buildings that appear to have been constructed using a combination of European and indigenous methods. Food remains that include both English domestic animals and traditional indigenous foods. And tool assemblages that combine European metal implements with indigenous stone and bone tools. This archaeological evidence supports a theory that has been gaining acceptance among scholars, that the lost colonists of Roanoke weren't lost at all, but were absorbed into indigenous communities where they lived, worked, and raised families according to indigenous customs and survival strategies. This would explain both the apparent disappearance of the colonists and the persistence of stories among later indigenous communities about European ancestors and unusual physical characteristics that suggested mixed ancestry. The implications of this theory extend far beyond solving a historical mystery. If the Roanoke colonists survived by integrating into indigenous communities, it suggests that early European colonization was far more dependent on indigenous cooperation and cultural adaptation than traditional narratives acknowledge. It also reveals indigenous communities as active agents in shaping early colonial outcomes, using their knowledge, resources, and political strategies to influence how European settlement developed. The Croatoan and other indigenous peoples of the Outer Banks were dealing with the same challenges that indigenous communities faced throughout the Americas: how to respond to European contact in ways that preserved their communities and way of life. But unlike many other indigenous groups, they may have found a strategy that worked, at least temporarily. By selectively incorporating European individuals into their communities while maintaining control over their territory and resources, they may have found a way to benefit from European contact while avoiding the most destructive consequences of colonization. This strategy required remarkable cultural flexibility and political sophistication. Indigenous communities had to develop new protocols for integrating foreign individuals, new ways of managing cultural differences, and new approaches to maintaining their identity while adapting to changing circumstances. European colonists, meanwhile, had to abandon their assumptions about cultural superiority and learn to survive according to indigenous knowledge and customs. The genetic and linguistic evidence for this integration remains frustratingly incomplete. By the time systematic European contact resumed in the region during the early 17th century, any evidence of English colonial integration into indigenous communities would have been several generations old and increasingly difficult to detect. European observers who might have noticed unusual physical characteristics or cultural practices among indigenous peoples often lacked the knowledge or interest to investigate their significance. But oral traditions among indigenous communities in the region have preserved stories that may provide clues to the fate of the Roanoke colonists. Accounts collected by early ethnographies describe families with unusual physical characteristics, particularly eye color and hair texture that differed from typical indigenous appearances. Some stories describe ancestors who spoke a different language or practiced unfamiliar customs that gradually became incorporated into local traditions. The mystery of Roanoke also reveals the sophisticated information networks that connected indigenous communities throughout the region. When John White carved instructions for the colonists to move to Croatoan if they left Roanoke Island, he was acknowledging indigenous communities' ability to maintain communication and coordinate activities across considerable distances. The fact that the colonists apparently followed these instructions suggests they had developed enough trust in indigenous political systems to place their lives in indigenous hands. Recent archaeological work has also uncovered evidence of what may have been indigenous efforts to maintain connections with the wider Atlantic world through the absorbed colonists. European artifacts found in indigenous sites from this period include items that would have been useful for long-distance communication or trade, suggesting that indigenous communities may have been trying to maintain or establish direct relationships with European trading networks. The environmental knowledge that indigenous communities possessed was crucial to colonial survival in ways that European accounts rarely acknowledge. The Outer Banks region is characterized by shifting barrier islands, unpredictable storms, and complex seasonal patterns of resource availability that require intimate knowledge of local conditions. European colonists who survived in this environment would have needed to learn not just specific techniques for finding food or building shelter, but entirely new ways of understanding and relating to their environment. This environmental adaptation would have involved learning indigenous agricultural techniques suited to sandy coastal soils, understanding the seasonal migrations of fish and game, and developing the skills necessary to navigate the complex waterways and shifting sandbars of the Outer Banks. Such knowledge couldn't be learned quickly or superficially. It required the kind of long-term immersion in indigenous communities that integration through marriage and adoption would have provided. The story of Roanoke, when viewed through this lens of indigenous agency and cultural adaptation, becomes not a story of European failure or mysterious disappearance, but a story of successful indigenous diplomacy and cultural preservation. The Croatoan and other indigenous peoples of the region may have found a way to manage European contact that preserved their communities while selectively adopting useful European technologies and knowledge. This success, if that's what it was, proved temporary. The establishment of Jamestown in 1607 and the subsequent rapid expansion of English settlement in Virginia created pressures that the flexible, diplomatic strategies that may have worked with small groups of isolated colonists could not withstand. The indigenous communities of the Outer Banks found themselves overwhelmed by the same forces of disease, violence, and territorial dispossession that had destroyed indigenous communities throughout the Americas. The cultural protocols that governed interactions between the Roanoke colonists and indigenous communities reveal sophisticated systems of diplomacy that Europeans rarely understood or appreciated. When indigenous leaders like Wingena or Manteo engaged with English colonists, they were following established traditions for managing relationships with foreign peoples, traditions that had evolved over generations of intertribal diplomacy and trade. These protocols involved careful assessment of the newcomers' intentions, strategic sharing of information and resources, and maintenance of indigenous control over the terms of engagement. The gift exchanges that took place between English colonists and indigenous peoples were not simple trade transactions, but complex social rituals that established relationships and obligations. When indigenous leaders presented colonists with food, furs, or other goods, they were initiating reciprocal relationships that, in indigenous understanding, created ongoing obligations for both parties. The English often misunderstood these exchanges as simple generosity or tribute, failing to recognize the social and political meanings that indigenous peoples attached to them. The linguistic challenges that both sides faced in attempting to communicate with each other shaped the entire trajectory of early English colonization in ways that are often underappreciated. The Algonquian languages spoken by indigenous peoples of the Outer Banks were grammatically and phonetically very different from English, making even basic communication difficult. Without shared language, misunderstandings were inevitable, and these misunderstandings often had fatal consequences as each side misinterpreted the other's intentions and actions. Some individuals on both sides made remarkable efforts to bridge this linguistic divide. Thomas Harriot, a mathematician and scientist who accompanied the first Roanoke expedition, worked systematically to learn the Algonquian language and created one of the first attempts to document an indigenous North American language using phonetic notation. His linguistic work, combined with his detailed observations of indigenous culture and society, provides some of the most valuable documentation we have of pre-colonial indigenous life on the Atlantic coast. Indigenous individuals like Manteo and Wanchese, who traveled to England with the English explorers, also served as crucial linguistic and cultural bridges. These men learned English, experienced English society firsthand, and returned to their communities with knowledge that would have been invaluable in understanding English intentions and capabilities. However, their experiences in England led them to very different conclusions about how their people should respond to English colonization. Manteo apparently concluded that cooperation offered the best path forward, while Wanchese became convinced that English colonization represented an existential threat that should be resisted. The archaeological evidence from Hatteras Island and other sites associated with the Roanoke colonists continues to yield new discoveries that complicate and enrich our understanding of what happened. Recent excavations have uncovered evidence of European presence at multiple locations throughout the region, suggesting that rather than remaining in a single location, the colonists may have dispersed to different indigenous communities. This pattern of dispersal would make sense as a survival strategy, spreading risk and allowing colonists to integrate into different communities where they might have personal connections or particular skills to offer. The material culture found at these sites reveals fascinating patterns of cultural blending and adaptation. European copper artifacts that have been reworked using indigenous techniques, indigenous pottery that incorporates European design elements, and tool assemblages that combine European metal implements with traditional stone and bone tools, all suggest ongoing interaction and cultural exchange rather than simple conquest or disappearance. These material remains tell stories of people learning new skills, adapting to new circumstances, and creating hybrid cultures that drew on both indigenous and European traditions. The role of children in this cultural blending deserves particular attention. Virginia, Dare, and other children born to English colonists on Roanoke would have been raised in an environment where indigenous and European cultures were necessarily intermixed. If these children survived and grew up in indigenous communities, they would have been native speakers of Algonquian languages, practitioners of indigenous customs, and members of indigenous kinship networks, even if their physical appearance might have marked them as different from other community members. The genetic legacy of possible Roanoke colonial integration into indigenous communities remains one of the most tantalizing aspects of this mystery. Various indigenous communities in the region have oral traditions about European ancestors, and some historical accounts describe individuals with unusual physical characteristics that suggested European ancestry. However, establishing definitive genetic connections has proven difficult, as centuries of subsequent European colonization, population movements, and intermarriage have created complex genetic patterns that are difficult to disentangle. Modern genetic studies of indigenous communities in the region have identified some individuals with European genetic markers that date to the appropriate time period. But interpreting this evidence is complicated by the multiple waves of European contact that occurred in the decades and centuries following Roanoke. DNA evidence alone cannot definitively prove that Roanoke colonists integrated into indigenous communities, but it is consistent with that possibility and provides intriguing hints that deserve further investigation. The political implications of the Roanoke story for subsequent English colonization efforts were profound. The apparent failure of Roanoke, combined with the earlier abandonment of the first colony, convinced many English investors and planners that successful colonization would require much larger initial investments, more careful planning, and more aggressive approaches to dealing with indigenous peoples. The lessons learned from Roanoke, both real and imagined, shaped the strategies that would be employed at Jamestown and other later colonial ventures. The environmental challenges that the Roanoke colonists faced would have made indigenous knowledge and assistance absolutely essential for survival. The Outer Banks region is characterized by poor soil for European-style agriculture, limited freshwater sources, and exposure to hurricanes and other severe weather events. European agricultural techniques and food preparation methods were poorly suited to this environment, while indigenous peoples had developed sophisticated strategies for obtaining food and water that were perfectly adapted to local conditions. The fishing and shellfishing techniques that indigenous peoples had perfected over centuries provided reliable sources of protein that European methods could not match. Indigenous knowledge of which fish were available in different seasons, where to find them, and how to preserve them for future use was essential for anyone hoping to survive in the region. Similarly, indigenous understanding of how to locate fresh water, how to predict and prepare for storms, and how to construct dwellings that could withstand coastal weather conditions represented knowledge that colonists desperately needed. The timing of the Roanoke ventures, coming during a period of unusual drought and environmental stress, added another dimension to the challenges that both colonists and indigenous peoples faced. Tree ring studies and other paleoclimatic evidence suggest that the late 1580s were among the driest years in centuries, creating food shortages that affected indigenous communities and made them less able or willing to provide assistance to English colonists. This environmental context helps explain why indigenous peoples, who had initially welcomed the English, became increasingly hostile as their own resources became strained. The political instability among indigenous communities during this period also played a crucial role in shaping English colonial experiences. The death of the powerful chief Windjuna and the subsequent power struggles among the Essecoton Confederacy created a fluid political situation in which different indigenous leaders pursued different strategies for dealing with the English presence. Some sought alliance, others advocated resistance, and still others tried to manipulate the English presence to advance their own political objectives within indigenous society. The spiritual and cosmological frameworks through which indigenous peoples understood the arrival of Europeans shaped their responses in ways that English colonists rarely recognized. The appearance of people with different physical characteristics, strange technologies, and foreign customs would have required indigenous peoples to incorporate these newcomers into their existing understanding of how the world worked. Some indigenous spiritual leaders apparently interpreted European arrival as having supernatural significance, while others saw it as simply another instance of foreign peoples arriving in their territory, similar to encounters with other indigenous groups. The disease environment of the late 16th century Outer Banks region was already beginning to be affected by European contact, even before the Roanoke colonies were established. Earlier Spanish expeditions to the region, and indirect contact through indigenous trade networks with areas where Europeans had been present, may have already introduced some European diseases to the population. This means that the demographic impact of European contact was already underway before English colonization began, weakening indigenous communities and making them more vulnerable to English encroachment. The documentary evidence for what happened to the Roanoke colonists remains frustratingly incomplete and ambiguous. John White's accounts of finding the settlement abandoned provide some clues, but raise as many questions as they answer. Later, English explorers gathered rumors and reports from indigenous informants about the fate of the colonists, but these accounts are often contradictory and were filtered through multiple layers of translation and interpretation. Some reports suggested colonists had been killed, others that they had moved to different locations, and still others that they had integrated into indigenous communities. The cultural memory of Roanoke, both in European and indigenous traditions, has been shaped by centuries of retelling that have added layers of myth and speculation to whatever historical reality underlies the mystery. For European Americans, Roanoke became a foundation myth about the challenges and mysteries of colonizing the New World. For indigenous peoples, the story became part of complex narratives about early encounters with Europeans and the various strategies that different communities employed in responding to colonial pressures. But for a brief period in the late 16th century, the mystery of Roanoke may represent something unprecedented in the history of European colonization, a successful example of indigenous communities maintaining control over the terms of cultural contact and exchange. If the lost colonists of Roanoke survived by becoming members of indigenous communities, their story represents not European exploration or indigenous victimization, but indigenous adaptation and agency in the face of unprecedented challenges. The hidden world of indigenous elite society, power, luxury, and diplomacy in pre-Columbian America. As we enter our final segment tonight, we journey into a world that European colonists encountered but rarely understood. A sophisticated realm of indigenous political power, economic networks, and cultural refinement that challenges every stereotype about pre-Columbian life in the Americas. Tonight, we explore the daily lives of indigenous elites, the chiefs, nobles, and wealthy traders who commanded vast territories, controlled complex economies, and lived in luxury that rivaled anything Europe could offer. When Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés first laid eyes on Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire, he was witnessing one of the largest and most sophisticated cities in the world. With a population approaching 200,000, Tenochtitlan was larger than Paris, London, or any other European city of its time. But beyond its impressive size, the city represented something that European minds struggled to comprehend: an entirely different model of urban civilization, political organization, and elite culture that had evolved independently for thousands of years. At the apex of this world stood figures like Moctezuma II, the Huitlatawani, or Great Speaker of the Aztec Empire, whose daily life unfolded in a palace complex that covered several acres and housed thousands of servants, artisans, and administrators. Moctezuma's morning routine began before dawn in quarters that were furnished with luxuries gathered from across Mesoamerica: jaguar pelts from the tropical lowlands, intricate featherwork from the cloud forests, precious jade and obsidian from distant quarries, and cacao from plantations hundreds of miles away. The emperor's breakfast was served on plates of pure gold, accompanied by drinks prepared from the finest cacao beans, flavored with vanilla and honey, and served in cups made from carved gourds decorated with precious metals. His meals included delicacies that European palates had never imagined. Turkey prepared with complex mole sauces, fresh fish transported overnight from both the Atlantic and Pacific coasts, tropical fruits preserved in honey, and dozens of varieties of corn prepared according to recipes that had been refined over centuries. But Moctezuma's luxury extended far beyond material comforts. He presided over an empire that encompassed most of central Mexico and managed tribute relationships with hundreds of subordinate communities. His palace functioned as the administrative center for a bureaucracy that collected taxes, managed trade relationships, administered justice, and coordinated military campaigns across vast distances. The daily operations of this government required a level of organizational sophistication that European observers consistently underestimated. The emperor's court included nobles, priests, merchants, artisans, and diplomats from throughout the known world of Mesoamerica. These individuals represented not just the Aztec heartland, but dozens of distinct ethnic groups, languages, and cultural traditions that had been incorporated into the empire through conquest, alliance, or voluntary association. Managing this diversity required diplomatic skills, cultural sensitivity, and administrative capabilities that few European rulers of the time could match. Similar levels of indigenous elite sophistication existed throughout the Americas, from the Inca palaces of Cusco to the great houses of ancestral Puebloan communities in the southwest. From the chiefly compounds of Cahokia in the Mississippi Valley to the elaborate ceremonial centers of the Maya in the Yucatan. Each of these societies had developed their own unique forms of elite culture, but all shared certain characteristics that set them apart from both European nobility and their own common people. In the Inca Empire, the Sapa Inca lived in a world of almost unimaginable luxury and ritual complexity. His palace in Cusco was constructed entirely of precisely fitted stone blocks, some weighing several tons, assembled without mortar into walls that have survived earthquakes that destroyed later Spanish colonial buildings. The rooms were decorated with sheets of beaten gold, silver, and precious textiles woven from the wool of vicucas and alpacas that grazed in the high Andes. The Sapa Inca's daily routine was governed by elaborate ceremonial protocols that reinforced his divine status while managing the practical necessities of governing an empire that stretched from modern-day Ecuador to Chile. His morning began with rituals that connected him to Inti, the sun god, performed in courtyards designed to capture and focus the first rays of sunlight. His meals were prepared by specialist cooks who had trained for years to master the complex techniques required for imperial cuisine. But perhaps most remarkably, the Inca emperor never wore the same clothes twice. After each day's activities, his garments, which were woven from the finest materials by master craftspeople, were ceremonially burned and replaced with entirely new outfits. This practice represented not just conspicuous consumption, but a form of ritual purification that maintained the emperor's divine status while providing employment for thousands of weavers, dyes, and tailors throughout the empire. The economic foundations that supported this indigenous elite luxury were far more complex and sophisticated than European colonists initially understood. Rather than simple tribute extraction or primitive accumulation, indigenous elite wealth was based on intricate systems of reciprocal exchange, specialized production, and long-distance trade that connected communities across vast distances and diverse environments. In the Maya world, elite families controlled access to luxury goods that moved along trade routes stretching from central Mexico to the mountains of Honduras. Cacao beans served as a form of currency that, facilitated exchange between communities that spoke different languages and practiced different customs. Jade, obsidian, salt, textiles, and exotic feathers moved along these networks in quantities that required sophisticated systems of transportation, storage, and quality control. Maya elite compounds in cities like Tikal, Palenque, and Caracol were not just residences, but centers of craft production, trade coordination, and diplomatic activity that required the services of hundreds of specialists. Scribes maintained records in hieroglyphic writing systems that recorded everything from astronomical observations to tribute payments. Artists created elaborate sculptures, paintings, and decorative objects that served both aesthetic and political functions. Engineers designed and maintained the complex water management systems that made large urban populations possible in tropical environments. The daily life of a Maya lord involved responsibilities that would have been familiar to any medieval European king: hearing legal disputes, negotiating treaties with neighboring cities, planning military campaigns, and managing the complex relationships between nobles, commoners, and slaves that defined Maya society. But Maya elites also had responsibilities that were uniquely American: maintaining relationships with the gods through elaborate ritual performances, managing agricultural cycles according to sophisticated calendrical systems, and preserving the astronomical and mathematical knowledge that was essential to Maya civilization. In North America, indigenous elite culture took different forms, but was no less sophisticated or impressive. At Cahokia, the great urban center that flourished in the Mississippi Valley between 1050 and 1350 CE, elite families lived in elaborate compounds that were constructed on artificial mounds that elevated them both literally and symbolically above the common population. These mounds required the movement of millions of cubic feet of earth, coordinated by engineers who understood principles of hydraulics, soil stability, and architectural design. The paramount chief of Cahokia presided over a city of perhaps 20,000 people and controlled trade relationships that extended from the Great Lakes to the Gulf Coast. Copper from the upper Great Lakes, shells from the Gulf Coast, obsidian from the Rocky Mountains, and mica from the Appalachians all flowed through Cahokia's markets, processed by specialist craftspeople who created luxury goods for elite consumption and long-distance trade. Archaeological excavations at Cahokia have revealed elite burials that contained thousands of marine shell beads, elaborately carved pipes, copper ornaments, and other luxury goods that represent wealth accumulation on a scale that was not seen again in North America until the Industrial Age. But these burials also revealed the dark side of indigenous elite power. Some contained the remains of sacrificed retainers, young women who were apparently killed to accompany their lord into the afterlife. The political power that supported indigenous elite luxury was often more complex and consensual than European models of monarchy or aristocracy. Many indigenous societies practiced forms of democratic governance that required even the most powerful chiefs to maintain the support of councils, clan leaders, or popular assemblies. This meant that indigenous elites had to be not just wealthy and powerful, but also skilled diplomats, generous patrons, and effective military leaders. Among the Iroquois, the Pine Tree Chiefs represented a form of elite status that was based entirely on merit rather than heredity. These individuals achieved their positions through demonstrated skill in warfare, diplomacy, or spiritual matters, and they maintained their authority only as long as they continued to serve their communities effectively. Pine Tree Chiefs lived in larger houses than common people, ate better food, and wore finer clothes. But their luxury was always conditional on their continued effectiveness as leaders. The diplomatic responsibilities of indigenous elites required them to master complex protocols for intergroup communication that often involved multiple languages, symbolic systems, and cultural traditions. A Cherokee chief negotiating with Creek representatives might need to understand not just the immediate political issues at stake, but the historical relationships between their peoples, the spiritual significance of proposed agreements, and the economic implications of any decisions reached. These diplomatic skills became crucial when indigenous elites encountered European colonists and had to develop strategies for managing relationships with peoples whose cultural assumptions and political objectives were completely foreign to indigenous experience. Leaders like Powhatan in Virginia, Massasoit in Massachusetts, and later figures like Alexander MacGillivray among the Creek had to navigate between maintaining their traditional authority within their own communities and adapting to the new realities created by European colonization. The material culture that surrounded indigenous elites reflected not just wealth, but sophisticated aesthetic traditions that had evolved over centuries. Maya nobles wore clothing decorated with complex symbolic designs that communicated their lineage, achievements, and spiritual connections. Aztec emperors were adorned with featherwork of such extraordinary craftsmanship that European observers compared it favorably to the finest textiles produced in Europe. In the Pacific Northwest, wealthy chiefs displayed their status through elaborate potlatch ceremonies that involved the distribution of vast quantities of luxury goods to guests from other communities. These events could last for days and might involve the giving away of thousands of blankets, carved boxes, copper shields, and other valuable items. The chief who hosted a successful potlatch demonstrated not just his wealth, but his generosity, his organizational abilities, and his commitment to the reciprocal relationships that bound Pacific Northwest communities together. The intellectual achievements of indigenous elites were perhaps even more impressive than their material luxury. Maya scribes developed writing systems that could record not just practical information, but poetry, history, and complex mathematical calculations. Aztec priest scholars maintained libraries of bark paper books that contained astronomical tables, historical records, and religious texts. Inca administrators used quipu systems of knotted cords to record information about population, tribute, and resource management with a precision that impressed even Spanish colonial officials. These intellectual traditions required educational systems that could train individuals in complex skills while preserving knowledge across generations. Elite children in many indigenous societies underwent years of formal education that included not just practical skills, but training in history, law, religion, and the arts. The Comicac schools of the Aztec Empire produced graduates who could serve as priests, administrators, diplomats, or military officers. Individuals whose education was probably superior to that available to most European nobles of the time. The religious responsibilities of indigenous elites connected them to spiritual traditions that provided both legitimacy for their authority and obligations to serve their communities in ways that went beyond simple political or economic leadership. Maya kings were expected to communicate with the gods through bloodletting rituals, vision quests, and elaborate ceremonies that required extensive knowledge of astronomical cycles and religious traditions. Inca emperors were considered divine beings whose relationship with the sun god Inti was essential to the fertility of the land and the prosperity of the empire. This divine status provided them with ultimate authority, but it also required them to maintain ritual purity and perform ceremonies that were essential to cosmic harmony. Failure to fulfill these obligations could result in natural disasters, military defeats, or popular uprisings that threatened not just their political power, but the survival of their entire society. As European colonization intensified, indigenous elite culture faced unprecedented challenges that ultimately proved insurmountable. The diseases that devastated indigenous populations affected elites and commoners alike. destroying the demographic foundations that supported complex political and economic systems. The Spanish conquest of the Aztec and Inca empires eliminated the apolitical structures that had coordinated vast territories and diverse populations. But perhaps most destructively, European colonization systematically targeted the cultural and intellectual foundations of indigenous elite society. Spanish missionaries burned Maya libraries, destroying centuries of accumulated knowledge. Colonial administrators dismantled indigenous educational systems and replaced them with European models that prepared indigenous people for subordinate roles in colonial society rather than leadership in their own communities. The legacy of indigenous elite culture, however, continues to influence the Americas in ways that are often unrecognized or underappreciated. The democratic ideals that influenced the founding of the United States drew inspiration from Iroquois political traditions. The agricultural techniques that sustained large urban populations in Mesoamerica provided the foundation for modern Mexican cuisine. The astronomical knowledge preserved by Maya scribes contributed to our understanding of ancient climate patterns and environmental changes. The architectural achievements of indigenous elite societies throughout the Pacific Americas rival and often surpass those of their European contemporaries in both engineering sophistication and aesthetic accomplishment. The Great Pyramids of Teotihuacan in central Mexico, constructed centuries before the Aztec Empire, demonstrate mathematical precision and astronomical alignment that required advanced knowledge of geometry, surveying, and celestial mechanics. The builders of these monuments moved millions of cubic meters of earth and stone, using human labor alone, organizing workforces on a scale that would not be seen again in the Americas until the Industrial Age. The urban planning principles employed by indigenous elites created cities that were often more livable and sustainable than European urban centers of the same period. Tenochtitlan's sophisticated system of causeways, canals, and aqueducts managed water resources with an efficiency that European engineers admired, even as they worked to destroy the city. The raised agricultural platforms called chinampas that surrounded the city produced crops year-round, using techniques that modern agronomists recognize as remarkably sustainable and productive. The Inca road system, stretching over 25,000 miles through some of the world's most challenging terrain, represents an engineering achievement that facilitated communication, trade, and military movement across an empire that encompassed modern-day Peru, Ecuador, Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina. These roads included suspension bridges that spanned deep gorges, tunnels through solid rock, and paved sections with drainage systems that remain functional centuries after their construction. The organization required to build and maintain this infrastructure demonstrates administrative capabilities that matched or exceeded those of any European empire. The artistic traditions that flourished under indigenous elite patronage created works of remarkable sophistication and beauty that challenge Western assumptions about the development of ascetic traditions. Maya sculptors created relief carvings of such delicacy and narrative complexity that they rival the finest works of classical Greece or Renaissance Italy. Moshe Pottus in Peru developed ceramic techniques that allowed them to create portrait vessels of such realism that individual faces can be recognized across multiple works, suggesting they were creating actual portraits of specific individuals. The textile arts that indigenous cultures developed reached levels of technical sophistication that European observers consistently failed to fully appreciate. Paracas textiles from coastal Peru, with their elaborate embroidery and complex color palettes derived from natural dyes, required thousands of hours of skilled labor to produce and demonstrate it. Aesthetic sensibilities that were entirely different from, but equally sophisticated as European textile traditions. The featherwork that Aztec artisans created for elite costumes and ceremonial objects used hundreds of thousands of individual feathers, arranged to create gradations of color and texture that European craftspeople found impossible to replicate. The metallurgical knowledge that indigenous elites commanded for both practical and aesthetic purposes was in some ways more advanced than European metallurgy at the same period. Andean metalworkers developed techniques for creating bronze alloys, for gilding copper with thin layers of gold, and for working platinum at temperatures that European smiths could not achieve. While indigenous peoples did not develop steel or use metal for many military applications, their sophisticated use of metals for jewelry, ceremonial objects, and some tools demonstrates technological capabilities that matched European achievements in different applications. The astronomical knowledge that indigenous elite societies developed and maintained served both practical and religious purposes that were deeply intertwined in ways that European observers struggled to understand. Maya astronomers tracked the movements of Venus with such precision that their calculations, recorded in hieroglyphic texts, differ from modern astronomical data by only fractions of a day over centuries. This knowledge required not just careful observation, but mathematical sophistication that included the concept of zero, which Maya mathematicians developed independently of its discovery in Asia. The agricultural innovations that indigenous elites sponsored and coordinated transformed the environments they inhabited and created food production systems that supported some of the densest populations in the pre-industrial world. The development of maize, from its wild ancestor, Teosinte, represents one of the most dramatic examples of plant domestication in human history, requiring centuries of careful selection and cultivation. The potato varieties developed by Andean farmers provided nutrition in high-altitude environments where European crops could not survive, while the irrigation systems that elite societies built in desert regions of Peru and the American Southwest supported agricultural production in areas that would otherwise have been unable to support large populations. The medical knowledge that indigenous societies accumulated and the healers who served elite households possessed was in many ways superior to European medicine of the same period. Andean surgeons performed successful trepanation operations, drilling holes in skulls to relieve pressure or treat injuries, with survival rates that exceeded those of similar European procedures. The pharmacological knowledge that indigenous healers developed from local plants included effective treatments for malaria, dysentery, and other diseases, treatments that Europeans would eventually adopt and that remain the basis for some modern medications. The social welfare systems that some indigenous elite societies developed reveal sophisticated understanding of how to maintain social stability and economic productivity through the strategic distribution of resources. The Inca Mita system, while involving forced labor that modern sensibilities recognize as oppressive, also included reciprocal obligations that required elite households to provide food, clothing, and support to workers and their families. The communal storehouses that Inca administrators maintained throughout the empire served as insurance against crop failures and natural disasters, distributing resources in ways that prevented the kind of famines that regularly devastated European populations. The educational systems that prepared individuals for elite roles in indigenous societies were often more meritocratic and comprehensive than European systems of the same period. While heredity certainly played a role in determining access to elite status, many indigenous societies also provided pathways for talented individuals from non-elite backgrounds to achieve positions of authority and prestige through demonstrated skill in warfare, administration, religious practice, or artistic production. The Comicoc schools of the Aztec Empire, the Yachi Wasi of the Inca, and similar institutions in other indigenous societies provided rigorous training in history, religion, administration, and the arts that produced graduates with sophisticated intellectual and practical skills. The legal systems that indigenous elites administered often operated according to principles that were different from, but no less sophisticated than, European legal traditions. The Aztec legal code made distinctions between different classes of crimes, provided for gradations of punishment based on the severity of offenses, and included appeals processes that allowed for review of judicial decisions. The Inca concept of A&I, reciprocal obligation between individuals and communities, provided a legal and moral framework that governed everything from labor obligations to marriage arrangements to warfare. The diplomatic protocols that indigenous elites developed for managing relationships with other societies involved elaborate ceremonial practices, gift exchanges, and negotiations that could last for months and involved hundreds of participants. The Great League of Peace among the Iroquois, according to traditional accounts, was established through negotiations that involved years of diplomatic effort. The development of elaborate rituals to commemorate the alliance, and the creation of a constitution that distributed power among member nations while maintaining mechanisms for collective decision-making on matters of common concern. The military organizations that indigenous elites commanded were often more flexible and adaptive than European military forces of the same period. Aztec military strategy combined conventional siege warfare with rapid mobile forces that could move quickly through difficult terrain. The specialized military units that served elite commanders included eagle and jaguar warriors who wore elaborate costumes that served both practical and psychological purposes, and who trained from youth in combat techniques that emphasized speed, precision, and coordinated group action. The economic networks that indigenous elites controlled extended across vast distances and connected communities with very different resources and production capacities. The Pochtica, professional merchants of the Aztec Empire, traveled throughout Mesoamerica, trading goods, but also gathering intelligence about foreign societies that was essential for diplomatic and military planning. These merchants operated under special legal protections and social status that recognized the importance of their role in maintaining the economic networks that supported elite power and luxury. The religious authority that indigenous elites claimed and maintained was inseparable from their political and economic power in ways that created integrated systems of social control and cultural meaning. The divine kingship practiced by Maya rulers, for example, required them to perform rituals that maintained cosmic balance and ensured agricultural fertility. Failure to perform these rituals correctly could result in drought, famine, or military defeat, making religious competence an essential qualification for political leadership. The libraries and record-keeping systems that indigenous elites maintained preserved knowledge across generations and facilitated the administration of complex societies, while only the Maya developed a fully functional writing system capable of recording spoken language. Other indigenous societies created sophisticated systems for recording information through pictographs, quipu knots, and mnemonic devices that trained specialists could use to preserve and transmit detailed information about history, tribute obligations, astronomical observations, and religious practices. The demographic impact of European colonization on indigenous elite societies was particularly devastating because elites were often targeted for elimination or forced conversion. Spanish conquistadors systematically killed or imprisoned indigenous rulers, destroyed symbols of elite authority, and worked to replace indigenous hierarchies with colonial administrative structures that served European rather than indigenous interests. The loss of these elite individuals and institutions meant the loss not just of political leadership, but of the cultural knowledge, artistic traditions, and organizational capabilities that they embodied. The few indigenous elite individuals who survived the initial waves of colonization and managed to maintain some authority in colonial societies often found themselves in impossible positions, trying to protect their communities while accommodating colonial demands that fundamentally contradicted indigenous values and interests. Some, like the descendants of Aztec emperors who received Spanish noble titles, became intermediaries between colonial authorities and indigenous communities, using their remaining authority to negotiate slightly better treatment while losing the respect of their own people, who saw them as collaborators. As European colonization intensified, indigenous elite culture faced unprecedented challenges that ultimately proved insurmountable. The diseases that devastated indigenous populations affected elites and commoners alike, destroying the demographic foundations that supported complex political and economic systems. The Spanish conquest of the Aztec and Inca empires eliminated the apolitical structures that had coordinated vast territories and diverse populations. But perhaps most destructively, European colonization systematically targeted the cultural and intellectual foundations of indigenous elite society. Spanish missionaries burned Maya libraries, destroying centuries of accumulated knowledge. Colonial administrators dismantled indigenous educational systems and replaced them with European models that prepared indigenous people for subordinate roles in colonial society rather than leadership in their own communities. The legacy of indigenous elite culture, however, continues to influence the Americas in ways that are often unrecognized or underappreciated. The democratic ideals that influenced the founding of the United States drew inspiration from Iroquois political traditions. The agricultural techniques that sustained large urban populations in Mesoamerica provided the foundation for modern Mexican cuisine. The astronomical knowledge preserved by Maya scribes contributed to our understanding of ancient climate patterns and environmental changes. As we conclude our exploration tonight of what really happened to Native Americans after Columbus, we must remember that the story is not simply one of destruction and disappearance, but also one of remarkable cultural achievements, sophisticated political systems, and forms of knowledge that continue to enrich human civilization. The indigenous elites who once ruled vast territories and commanded impressive resources were not primitive chieftains ruling over simple societies, but sophisticated leaders managing complex civilizations that were in many ways more advanced than their European contemporaries. Their world was one of luxury and power, but also of responsibility and service to communities that had developed over thousands of years of cultural evolution. When European colonization destroyed these societies, humanity lost not just political entities or economic systems, but entire ways of being human that had created remarkable achievements in art, science, governance, and spiritual understanding. Thank you for joining me tonight on this journey through one of history's most complex and tragic stories. The real story of what happened to Native Americans after Columbus is not just about conquest and resistance, but about the collision between different forms of human civilization, each with their own remarkable achievements and profound limitations. As you settle into sleep tonight, perhaps you'll dream of the great cities that once rose from the American landscape, of the sophisticated leaders who once governed vast territories with wisdom and skill, and of the knowledge and achievements that remind us that human greatness takes many forms and speaks in many voices. Until next time, rest well. And remember that history's most important stories are often found not in the grand narratives we learned in school, but in the quiet details of daily life, the complex motivations of individual people, and the remarkable resilience of human cultures facing unprecedented challenges. Sweet dreams, and thank you for being part of our growing community of curious minds exploring the fascinating complexity of our shared human past.